So last night I got this email in my hotel. I shouldn't bring my email with me. From Kazuki asking me to say a few words for younger investigators, advice on how to live their lives. I got to say I'm somewhat reluctant to do that. I'm not an oracle. And everybody has to establish his own research style. But I thought it might be useful if I just sort of said a few themes that seem to have influenced me in my research style over the years, and maybe some of you will find these useful comments. So I jotted down a couple of points, and I even managed a sort of semi-useful PowerPoint, although I don't quite know how that simple got there, nor do I know how to get rid of it. The first point I see as I look back at my own career, and I think many of you may think this useful in your careers, is it's really important to focus on the study of behavior. And I think it's especially important to say that today, where so many people are interested in neuroscience, and they go directly to neuroscientific investigations, and often neglect the behavioral bases that are so important to justifying and to making sense out of the neuroscience in terms of psychology. And we need to have people whose primary concern is behavior and who stick to behavior. Neuroscience is great to do, but often it's done on the basis of very poorly established behavioral phenomena, and on the basis, frankly, of very poorly understood behavior by people doing the neuroscience. So I think it's really important to keep the focus on behavior. Certainly, in my career, that's what I've done, partly because I don't ever understand neuroscience. The second thing I think is really important is when you have different accounts of behavior, try to focus on what the critical ones are. Try to figure out what it is that's really the essential difference that makes a theory different from another. So today, for instance, I talked about two stimuli moving the same amount. And that's really a critical difference between that theory and other theories. And you have to try to pull those kinds of critical features out. It's easy to get hung up on minor, uninteresting features of theories, because they're often easier to test. But it's important to try to focus on the critical ones. And the thing that I think is most important is try every time to design the perfect experiment. Now, you'll fail. You'll never design the perfect experiment. But try every time. And every time when you run your control group and your experimental group, ask yourself what the other differences are there are between those groups than the critical difference. And don't be easy on yourself. When you find another difference, fix it. Don't let yourself get away with running less than the most perfect experiment you can. Third point is, this is almost a propaganda point, but if you want to have an influence on people, try to find the most outrageous and improbable prediction from the theory and test it, because that's when you're going to influence people. I mean, that's the kind of thing that Wagner and I did when we produced our theory. The first thing I realized was it predicted the phenomenon of over-expectation. The over-expectation, for some of you who don't know it, is you train two stimuli separately, and then you put them together and train them as a compound. The theory predicts that when you reinforce that compound, each of the stimuli will lose strength, despite the fact that you're reinforcing the stimuli. Now, at the time we did that, nobody thought that would happen. I certainly didn't think that would happen, and I set out to test it because I thought that would destroy the Rescorla Wagner model. And as a result of it coming around, you see, it really boosted the model. And the same thing for other phenomena like superconditioning that actually I showed you an example of today that I didn't focus on. So I think it's important to try to pick that most improbable prediction. Because after all, what's the game? The game is to prove your theory wrong. I mean, that's really the game. That's what science is all about. So, don't pull your punches. Go after your theory with everything you got. Another thing that I think often is lost in graduate training particularly, learning to speak and write clearly is at least as important as learning to think and design experiments clearly. I can't tell you how many of my colleagues I know in science and psychology in the United States who are brilliant people, have really interesting ideas, and nobody pays any attention to them because they can't express those ideas clearly in a way which they have an impact. And if you want to have an impact, you've got to be able to write and speak clearly. And that means practice. That's hard work. You got to get somebody, your wife, colleague, somebody to listen to you, bumble through your talks, and make them clearer and clearer. Another thing that I think is often lost is you've got to be generous with your students. You've got to give them credit, right? They're your legacy. I mean, you think of your experiments as your legacy, but they're not. Your experiments are going to disappear. It's your students that are going to be your legacy. And it's really important, especially those of your students now will know what I'm talking about. Your advisor just doesn't give you enough credit. And you know, if you don't do that, you're not going to read the next generation. When I was a graduate student, I remember very, very clearly, Dick Solomon was my advisor. I don't know how many of you know him. He was a very generous person. We were writing a paper together, which was basically his idea. It was called, it was on two-process avoidance learning. And the following would happen. He would write a draft, and I'd work on it, and I'd write a draft and give it back to him. Every time I gave him the draft back, he was the first author. Every time he gave it back to me, he turned it around and made me the first author. And this had happened 5 or 6 times. Of course, these were the days when you had secretaries typing things. So I said to him, Dick, your secretary's making a mistake. She's putting me as the first author. And he said, oh no, that's no mistake. I'm making you the first author because I'm well known and you're not. And if you're not the first author, nobody will remember you. So you have to be the first author. Now that kind of generosity is the kind of thing that I think makes students proud and stand tall and makes them want to do work on their own. And I think that's very important, having something like experience like that. And the last thing I want to say is respect your own time. Don't waste your time doing experiments somebody else will do. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I don't want to be scooped, I want to go do this before anybody else gets to it. My reply to that is, if you're worried about being scooped, do something else. Because that means somebody else is going to do that work anyway. It doesn't need you. So find something that you think nobody else will do, and do it, because otherwise you're not respecting your own time. You're just doing something less important. So I don't know, these are things that it seems to me you might want to give some thought to as you plan your career. They're not, you know, details about how you design experiments and all that sort of thing, but they are sort of attitudinal. And I do think these kinds of attitudinal things matter for students. So those are my thoughts.